Thanks for joining. Before we get started, please make sure you are following us on all the various platforms we're publishing on, here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube, the written stuff on Substack, as well as the quick takes on Threads and on Instagram. Make sure you're sharing out with your friends and with your family all the stuff that we're publishing, giving us that big thumbs up, giving us that 5-star rating and review. There's a lot of talk, a lot of discussion about diet and about diet and exercise that relates to weight loss and overall health. And there's a point of view that some people take as, well, men will respond one way and women will respond another way. There's a lot of discussions that go into play as it relates to why some people tend to lose weight while other people tend to gain weight, even though they're following the same diet. There's a lot of research out there that suggests that fasting style diets are very effective for both men and for women. But an interesting point comes into play, particularly when we start looking at specific dieting styles within the fasting style diets, in particular intermittent fasting. Findings that tend to show that men and women don't respond the same. In fact, women and men tend to respond quite differently. Why is that? Is there something special about men? Is there something special about women that will cause them to react quite differently to even following the same style of dieting? So let's go ahead and let's talk about why we might see the gender differences between men and women as relates to following a fasting style diet.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
How can it be so different? Did you know that men and women show a different response to fasting? Fasting style diets have quickly become one of the more popular ways to establish nutrient and caloric restrictions in the pursuit of weight loss. While some have found this style of diet to be simply a fad, there is ample evidence to indicate that this fasting style diet has benefit. Fasting seems easy enough, but there is not a single means by which we can perform fasting style diets. We have to remember that fasting is simply restricting how much you eat and when you are eating. There are a whole bunch of ways in which we can fast. There's a whole bunch of ways in which we cannot fast. Anytime we're eating, we're not fasting. Anytime we're skipping meals, we are fasting. For some proponents of this fasting style diet, it means limiting when food is eaten throughout the day. This type of fasting style diet should be called time-restricted feeding. For others, it's a means of cycling between restricted intake, fasting, or abstaining from eating that is followed by normal consumption of food. This is best known as true intermittent fasting. Similar to intermittent fasting is the idea of alternate day fasting, where one would flip between fasting for one day and then normal eating on the next. And there's even a third way to look at this idea, where dieting takes on the form of prolonged fast, where we are minimizing nutrient consumption. We're consuming the minimum requirement that we need for a day for the macronutrients and for the micronutrients. This is what's referred to as fasting mimicking diet. We traditionally look at the style of dieting as a means to improve metabolic health, but not necessarily the way in which we think about it in terms of the popularity that this diet seems to have taken on, which is a means by which we can lose weight. Within the research realm, this kind of idea about weight loss coming from a fasting style diet has become more popular in research avenues and has become a primary focus of a lot of weight loss interventions recently. We've previously talked about this when we looked at the way in which we can establish an intermittent fasting, what's the difference between those three styles of intermittent fasting, time-restricted feeding, and fasting mimicking dieting. And we've looked at it in terms of looking at what kinds of global responses can we get. The similarities that we see in terms of responses based off of the evidence that we have for the various types of fasting style diets for both men and for women. Where we see similar responses based off of adherence rates, the relative amount of weight loss and body compositional changes that can take place, improvements in cardiovascular functions and reduction in total cholesterol, as well as our low-density lipoproteins, the LDLs. Globally, we seem to have this kind of similarity. However, the way in which the physiology of the body is set up, if we start looking at how this dieting trend goes for the long term outside of the short duration studies that we tend to look at, we start looking at both the clinical side of stuff as well as the anecdotal side of stuff. What are the individual reports that we get about these dieting trends, about the way in which the body responds to the diets? So we know that we have responses that indicate both men and women can benefit from following a fasting style diet. The interesting point that comes into play here is the point of contention. And the point of contention is that when we start examining the published responses of the various styles of fasting diets, and we take out the intermittent fasting from the other types of fasting style diets, we start seeing quite different responses in between men and women. Men and women start to respond differently on the intermittent fasting style of dieting versus the fasting style dieting of time-restricted eating or of fasting mimicking diets. And the differences that arise are arising both during the intermittent fasting periods as well as after the intermittent fasting periods. And we start seeing dissimilar responses associated with changes in diabetic indices, changes in levels of insulin, changes in levels of glucagon, changes in A1C levels. We also see changes in the amount or dissimilarities in the changes in the amounts of fatty acids that we see in circulation and fatty acid metabolism in the body. The changes that we see in terms of these metabolic responses is where men tend to respond in such a way that makes them appear more normal in their responses, both during and after the intermittent fasting periods, while women tend to not show that same normalization in the signals when using the intermittent fasting style diet. Within the intermittent fasting, other dissimilarities that we start looking at come about based off of changes in metabolic rates. And part of this comes into play as to why we might see some dissimilarity in terms of body compositional changes. And based off of other stimulus within the interventions, we might see dissimilar body weight changes. For men following intermittent fasting, we tend to see an increased metabolic rate, whereas for women, we tend to see a decreased metabolic rate, particularly during the fasts within the intermittent fasting. There's another change that takes place that shows a dissimilar response that we see in between men and women as relates to the intermittent fasting, and that's what's referred to as return to eating. When we come back to food during the intermittent fasting, so we have our 2 days of fasting followed by our normal consumption, followed by our 2 days of fasting, followed by our normal consumptions on the intermittent fasting cycle, women show what's referred to as a linear return to eating. That means they're going to progress in a linear fashion, 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3, fashion of consumption of foods following a return to eating. Whereas men show a delayed curvilinear response in terms of the return to eating, where they will still consume fewer nutrients and a lower total caloric, put quotes around that, load relative to the women in general populations. This means that we would expect to see potential differences in total changes in body composition, total changes in metabolic functions in between men and women. And part of this has to deal with the responses that we see metabolically for women relative to metabolically for men in response to any style of diet that involves excessive amounts of restriction, regardless of how we're going to label that dietary pattern. Which takes us to our question, why? Why would men and women respond differently to diets that utilize fasting similarly? Now, most of us might immediately answer, it has to be because of testosterone, or it's estrogen, no duh. Those are the typical culprits that we're going to discuss whenever we try to discuss physiological differences that might exist between the socially identified genders of men and women. While there are differences in these hormones, the responses that we see during periods of intermittent fasting or excessive restriction go well beyond just those two hormones. This is where we have to look at, okay, what are all of the hormones that might come into play that might impact metabolic responses to nutrients, to dieting, to fasting, and how those differences in hormonal responses might allow us to have a rational response, a rationalization, a reason for why we see differences in between men and women during these fasting periods. When we start looking at this, a lot of us will then say, okay, if it's not estrogen, it's not testosterone, then it has to be how we respond to our quote unquote hunger hormones, in particular leptin and in particular ghrelin. One of the things we have to look at is the fact that of all of the hormones that might impact physiological responses differently, the biggest response we might see has to deal with the sensitivity that women have to leptin that men do not have. leptin has a greater impact on the metabolism of women than it does on the metabolism of men. Where any change in leptin, by extension, will have a greater impact on the overall metabolic functions of the women. When we start following fasting or excessive restriction diets, we will see greater changes in leptin. And those greater changes in leptin will lead to the responses that we see in women, the reduced metabolic rate, the linear return to normal eating, that we don't see in men. And that has to do with what leptin does in terms of its regulatory functions as relates to food consumption and as relates to metabolic rates. But that's not the only thing that leptin is going to do that's going to lead to this different responses that we might see in between men and women. And it's not the only hormone that we're going to have differences in between men and women. And so what are all of those other hormones that we have to worry about? If it's not just leptin, and if it's not just testosterone, and if it's not just estrogen differences, what other hormones do we have to worry about? This is where we're going to have to worry about hormones like adenosine, signals like adenosine monophosphate kinase, AMPK, hormones like adiponectin and adipocin, adrenal androgen or DHEAS, cortisol, dopamine, epinephrine or adrenaline, estrogen, ghrelin, glucagon-like peptide or GLP-1, growth hormone, insulin, insulin-like growth factors, IL-6, IL-10, irisin, leptin, myokines, a whole bunch of hormones coming from skeletal muscle that are going to regulate a lot of metabolic functions, norepinephrine or noradrenaline, opsitin, orexins, oxycalin, oxytomodulin, pancreatic peptide, resistin, retinol binding protein, testosterone, thyroid hormones, serotonin, visfatin, just to name a few. That is just a few of all of the hormones that are going to have some sort of impact on overall metabolic rates, where we do see slightly different gender responses to the various hormones that can lead to the changes that we see in terms of metabolic rate, as well as metabolic responses to the various types of dietary patterns, in particular when we have excessively restricted diets that we might see with prolonged fasting or the intermittent fasting periods. It's this hormonal change that we see that is why it's very difficult to equate simply fasting, simply changing nutrient intake with overall metabolic changes and weight loss within the ideas about dieting as it relates to body weight, body composition, and overall health. So we know that changes in leptin is going to lead to changes in feeding response, desire to eat through, changes of hypothalamic signaling coming into play, changes in orexin signals coming from the hypothalamus out to the pituitary into other areas of the brain, changing dopamine, changing serotonin signals that lead to the desire to eat. But that's not the only change that's going to take place. Because once again, it's about changes in total metabolic functions that come about due to changes in hormones based off of nutrient load, nutrient intake that's associated with the highly restrictive diets, the intermittent fasting diets, the prolonged fasts that can take place within the fasting style diets. So what other changes might take place, and how might those changes also help explain some of the differences that we're going to see in between genders as relates to all of the metabolic changes, as well as the weight loss that we're all trying to seek from doing these dietary changes. There are also noted changes in the pituitary and hypothalamic hormone responses that we'll see that occur during the intermittent fasting periods, all linked to changes in leptin and other adipokines, the hormones coming from our fat cells. Changes that will directly impact metabolic rate through regulation of the production and release of growth hormone and the regulatory hormone, in particular thyroid stimulating hormone, reducing the amount of certain hormones, in particular the large version of the growth hormone molecules, as well as the thyroid stimulating hormone, that lead to a reduction in metabolic rate that parallels the reduction in nutrients coming from the fast. The changes in overall metabolic rate that we see through these hormonal signals is why we tend to have a general idea that as we have prolonged fast, as we have a reduction in what everybody talks about as caloric intake, we tend to see a reduction in overall metabolic rate. These changes tend to be more pronounced in women than in men. And the change that we see in women relative to men is based off of the sensitivity of the hypothalamus and the sensitivity of the pituitary to leptin within the regulatory pathways, as well as changes that we see in terms of metabolic signaling coming away from increased amounts of ketone and ketogenic processes that occur when we have prolonged amounts of fasting taking place or an excessively amount of restriction within the diet. For women, where we have a more pronounced reduction in metabolic rate versus what we see in men. We also see changes in levels of glucose, ketones, and fatty acids that are going to be key regulatory elements in the production of that lead to greater amounts of the smaller version of growth hormone that are responsible for breakdown of fats throughout the body and improving glucose levels by assisting the actions of glucagon that occur during periods of prolonged fasts. Changes that can be less pronounced in women relative to men for a host of reasons. In particular, the reliance upon growth hormone, in particular large molecule growth hormone, for the regulation of anabolic responses in the body, tissue building responses in the body, that we see in women relative to what we see in men due to the differences that we have in other anabolic tissue building hormones, in particular testosterone. Within these hormonal responses, the other responses that we might see outside of the testosterone responses, which we'll get to here a little bit more in a second, and the regulatory response that we see in terms of reproductive functions, is the overall responses that we might see within the liver as relates to signals of glucagon and the signals of the what we refer to as the counter-regulatory hormones that are meant to reestablish normal glucose levels, normal glycemic responses, so as to offset any type of hypoglycemia, too low of blood sugar, that is seen with fasting and or excessively restrictive diets. Where we have a difference in gender responses, where women tend to respond slightly different than men do as it relates to those signals, where we get a disruption in the normal counter-regulatory responses that can lead to prolonged amounts of hypoglycemia in women relative to men that can and does lead to changes in signaling from like adenosine and other regulators for hunger responses, which may explain why we see that linear response to eating once food is reintroduced. The other hormonal responses that we have to look at coming away from the hypothalamus and the pituitary that are going to lead to difference in responses that we might see between men and women has to deal with the hormones that are going to be regulating reproductive functions. Changes in reproductive hormones can lead to men showing a relative increase in testosterone and testosterone receptors, along with increasing in luteinizing hormone, which is a key regulator in overall testosterone production. Those changes in terms of testosterone and in terms of testosterone receptors is why we may see an increase in overall metabolic rates for men that we don't see in terms of women. And that's because the changes that we see in women can lead to a reduction in ovary functions, reduction in estrogen levels, and possible change in androgen levels because of changes in circulating levels of metabolites leads to a change in FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, due to alterations of a hypothalamic hormone known as kisspeptin. Kisspeptin is a hormone that's going to come from the hypothalamus that's going to control how much FSH is being produced and released, which is going to trigger changes in ovary functions. Leptin and other adipokines drastically change how the hypothalamus will allow for production of kisspeptin. Where we see these drastic changes in leptin during fasts is going to slow the amount of kisspeptin that's being released, which in turn is going to reduce FSH, which is going to slow down overall ovary metabolism, which is going to alter the steroid hormones coming away from the ovaries, which can alter overall metabolic rates and metabolic functions. A consequence of this impact for women is that we're going to see a much lower rate of metabolism. We're going to see a reduction in overall reproductive functions. It's a consequence that impacts women more than men simply because kisspeptin has a greater impact on female metabolism than it does on male metabolism. Women are more sensitive to leptin and to kisspeptin than men are, leading to greater changes in sex hormone responses that we see in women relative to men. The fasting levels of the circulating metabolites, especially fatty acids, change the way in which we have steroid production, sex hormone production. High amounts of fatty acids in circulation, particularly the non-metabolizing fatty acids in circulation, tend to act as an inhibitory agent to testosterone production, which means that when a male is, or when a man is over fat and has excessive amounts of bad cholesterol, excessive amounts of triglycerides in circulation, we tend to have a blunting effect on a reduction in the amount of testosterone being produced. Whereas when we start having these fasts, when we have these prolonged fasts, we alter that fatty acid metabolism, which is going to allow for greater amounts of testosterone to possibly be produced. For women, we don't see that same type of response. We don't see a drop in these fatty acid levels. We don't see a drop in the cholesterol levels that would allow for stimulation of FSH, stimulation of estrogen, stimulation of progesterone, as well as adrenal androgen, that would allow for the anabolic sex hormone responses to come about to increase metabolic activity associated with reproductive functions, which means that we're not going to see an increase in overall metabolic rates due to the changes in those types of steroid hormones. Now, here's the interesting thing. The differences that we see in response to hormones like leptin and adipokines and ghrelin and other metabolic regulatory hormones in response to fasting is the same that we see in response to normal eating. And this can explain some of the weight loss issues that we'll see throughout life in between men and women, in particular once reproductive age has reached. But more importantly, can it help explain why weight loss in postmenopausal women can be quite difficult? Additionally, the differences that we see in hormonal responses not only explain the differences that we see in fasting, but also the differences we see during normal food intake. Variations that can help us understand and recognize differences that are seen in general nutrition recommendations for men and for women. Along with the explanation for why we might have difference in the estimation equations that we use for men and women in order to determine overall metabolic rate. Which takes us to another question that we're going to address here. What should we do? This is where it's important to understand and reflect upon a couple of key factors when it comes to the issues surrounding diet and weight loss. First, if someone's going to choose a fasting style diet, the use of time-restricted feeding or alternate day fasting will be a better option than following an intermittent fasting diet for both genders, for both socially accepted genders or socially recognized genders, in terms of male and female or men and women. The changes that we make in diet should not reflect caloric balance, even though we have this inclination to establish an excessively negative caloric balance in order to cause weight loss, which is a misconception about how diet and nutrition works. This is where we have to reflect upon the fact that all dietary plans, all dietary and exercise plans, a small change in nutrient balance accompanied with exercise is more effective than making large drastic changes, especially if we're going to make changes that are self-selected, self-monitored in terms of the behaviors that we're going to select so as to terminate yo-yoing within diet and exercise. This is where we have to make a caveat in our diet and exercise plan, in our diet and exercise ideals, is that it's not about weight loss. It's about changes in our health and in our performance as the primary principal goals for everything we're doing in terms of diet and exercise, where weight, even though we want to think about it as a primary focus, is actually a secondary goal, a secondary thing we're working towards doing, which is going to take us into another idea that we're going to cover here, which is how can we better diet so as to allow for that prolonged weight loss, that prolonged improvement in overall health. This is where we have to look at it in diet is same way we look at it in terms of exercise. So we're not going to cause yo-yoing. So we're not going to be excessively restrictive. So we're going to be able to see intermittent goals along the path to our overall goal we want to reach. And that's by following a dietary plan that involves periodization of our diet. This is where we're not going to have times where we're going to be excessively restricted for long periods of time in terms of our diet. This is where we're not going to have excessive fasting within our diet. This is where we're not going to have excessive restrictions within our diet. This is where we're going to look at, okay, how can I make dietary changes that are going to coincide with my changes in exercise so that I can have prolonged, sustained gains in my overall performance on my way to my weight loss goals. And so periodization is really looking at how we can go about varying the various types of stresses and stimuli that we have within our training regimens, within our diet, within our exercise, that will allow us to have continuous improvements, that allow us to have continuous weight loss if we're looking at weight loss. The idea about periodization kind of goes more into the exercise realm as opposed to the diet realm. And so why is that? Why is it that we don't periodize diets as regularly as we would periodize exercise? A lot has to do with the way in which we perceive diet and the idea that we have to have a consistency in our diet in order to establish the optimal performance or establish the essentials that are needed for good health or for weight loss. Ideals that focus on really the discussion that diets are individually tailored to meet specific metabolic demands and metabolic needs. And the ideas about this individuality within the tailoring of the diet is about what types of macronutrients, what type of micronutrients are we going to be consuming within a given day, within a given week, within a given month. And so when we start looking at this idea about the individuality of diets, one of the things we have to take into account is what type of metabolic demands are we placing in our body? What type of demands do we have for our macronutrients, for our carbohydrates, for our proteins, for our lipids? What is our needs and demands for vitamins, for minerals, based off of what the metabolic demand happens to be for that day? A lot of times we start looking at this idea about periodization, particularly periodization of diets and periodization of exercise and the relationship between exercise and diet. It goes into that really bad idea about the necessity for dealing with caloric balance. That is, what percentage am I going to have of my diet made up of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins based off of the percentage of my total caloric intake for the day, as opposed to what's the need based off of my relative body mass. Ignoring the stipulations and recommendations that lie into the distinct dietary patterns that we might have, there's also a lot of cultural standards that we have to take into account that are going to align with what is being accepted as correct societally, socially, culturally, as well as how am I going to agree with what's being presented to me about diet and exercise in terms of the ever-changing requirements that I might have based off of what I pick up and what I perceive within my social media feeds. The actions that we tend to look at in regards to the social, the cultural, the social media influences leads to a lot of the propagation of the fad diets that we like to talk about and like to discuss in terms of either being bad or good or acceptable or unacceptable, that instill cognitive drives that are associated with a lot of what we want to eat, what we want to avoid eating, and can lead to a lot of eating issues. And this is where we can start looking at, okay, how can I modify what I'm doing in terms of my diet to meet my long-term goals? How can I alter the diet sporadically to meet changes in my metabolic demands? How can I possibly force changes in my metabolic demands based off of the change in nutrient load that I'm giving in my diet? This is where we have to look at nutrient load and not necessarily caloric load within our foods. This is where we have to take into account the availability of nutrients that's going to directly impact metabolism based off of the flexibility that we have for distinct metabolites in different types of metabolic processes, the distinct nutrients that we need in order to establish different types of metabolism taking place. Things are going to influence my performance. Things are going to influence my muscle strength, my muscle endurance, my cardiovascular endurance, my immune responses to stress, my neurological and cognitive functions, the ability to utilize different types of metabolites for different types of metabolic processes, you utilize different types of nutrients for different types of metabolic processes that are all going to be influenced by my level of inflammation, my level of immune functions, and my ability to use different types of metabolites, not just be reliant upon one type of metabolites. And this is where we have to recommend kind of a different approach to diets, the periodized approach to diet, where we're going to approach diet in a very similar fashion that we do when we approach exercise. We're going to look at the variability of nutrients based on addressing what are the core values that we're trying to change in order to establish increases of performance, better performance coming out of the combination of diet and exercise within our everyday lifestyle. This is where we have to look at, okay, what are the proportions? What are the ratios that we're going to have within our meals? This is where we have to look, okay, what's my nutrient balance point? How many meals am I going to eat in a day? What is the quality of the nutrients that I'm going to be having in my food? And this is where we have to take a step back and reflect on what we just discussed as it relates to the whole idea about fasting. And the fact that when I start to become excessively restrictive in my nutrients, I'm going to have a possible change in my hormonal responses, which is going to change my metabolic responses, which can make me feel hungrier coming out of any type of dietary restriction, that can alter my metabolic rates, that can alter my overall metabolic functions, that can actually be more detrimental to my overall goals than what I would hope to get from doing any type of dietary change. When we start looking at this manipulating of our diet in order to get responses, when we start looking at it in terms of the periodization idea, we usually don't get a lot of information from the research as it relates to doing this kind of sporadic manipulation of diet in terms of whole-scale diet. There are some research out there, there's a lot of research out there that discusses periodization of diet, particularly periodization of diet as relates to athletic performance, but there's not much for everybody else. And when we start looking at what's out there for athletic performance, it's really about changing dietary parameters based off of, am I trying to be hypertrophic? Am I trying to build muscle? Am I trying to change my aesthetics? Am I trying to lose body fat? Am I trying to improve my endurance? And when we start looking at what's out there in terms of dietary restrictions for periodization purposes, it's really looking at the endurance aspect of the athletic performance and the changes in endurance aspects of athletic performance that gets extrapolated into other avenues. And this is where we are really looking at, and it's really a reflection of the consumption of sugars in the diet and how much of my diet in terms of the caloric balance, because this is what the research is looking at. It's not really looking at nutrient balance, it's looking at caloric balance. How much of my caloric balance is made up of carbohydrates? And we basically have 4 distinct types of periodizations offered in the research. And the 4 distinct periodizations that are offered in the research is what's referred to as train high, compete high, train low, compete high, recovery low, sleep low, train low. So train high, compete high. This is where I'm going to have a high carbohydrate diet with additional carbohydrate intake before, during, and after training. And what we're trying to do with this type of periodization within the diet is we're trying to make sure that glycogen content stays high. With the train low, compete high, this is where I'm going to utilize a low carbohydrate diet during a 7 to 10 day window of time. So this is kind of what we use when we're trying to do a carbohydrate loading style diet, where for 7 to 10 days, we're going to follow low carbohydrate. And then at the end of that, we're going to carbo load for about 3 to 4 days heading into competition. What this is meant to do is it's meant to replenish and grow glycogen stores like we talked about previously. Recovery low, sleep low is where I'm going to have lower carbohydrate diet in the afternoon and evening, particularly following a late day workout. What we're going to try to do here is I'm going to try to deplete all of my glycogen stores so that when I do consume carbohydrates later on, I'm able to get greater glycogen stores, very similar to a carbohydrate loading diet. Sleep low, train low is where I'm going to be restricting carbohydrate intake late in the day and into the night, so as to deplete muscle glycogen, leading into a morning exercise routine. And that morning exercise routine is then going to deplete the carbohydrate storages even more, so that when I do consume carbohydrates later on in the day, I'm able to once again replenish glycogen stores more readily, get larger amounts of glycogen stores. So the idea here is basically looking at how can I change my energetic metabolism away from carbohydrates into fats during the periods where I have low carbohydrate intake. And this is basically trying to put me into a ketogenic state during that time, including during the time of exercise. And so while we have this kind of idea as it relates to the athlete, and particularly the athlete where we're trying to make sure that glycogen stores either don't get too low or we're able to replenish glycogen stores quite readily, we don't actually look at it in terms of everybody else. And so can we extrapolate from the information available in order to get some points on how we can get through stagnations in our weight loss, in our health improvements, in our performance improvements, but at the same time limit the negative reinforcers and the negative outcomes that can come from the excessive restrictive diets? That is, can we make small changes so that we're not going to fail at the diets in the long term because of the over-restrictiveness that diets might have? But at the same time, we're able to kind of modify our metabolic responses so that we're able to get through plateaus in such a way that we have continuous improvement. Where we can make changes in the diet is going to encourage continuous adaptations, muscle growth, weight loss, body compositional changes, and improvements in performance, gains in strength, gains of endurance, gains of power, simply by modifying how we go about changing our diets. And like I said, most of the research that we have is basically on the athletic endeavor side and not directly linked to the aesthetic changes, the changes in body mass, changes in body fat. But if we look at what the world of bodybuilding has to offer, what the world of bodybuilding has to offer is at least an anecdotal, a clinical evaluation of these concepts. Because what the world of bodybuilding has offered us is it's offered us ideas into how we can go about periodizing our diets without looking at just doing this sugar modifications. This is where we can extrapolate from what the bodybuilders have to offer into the practicing of bulking and cutting. And we're talking about bulking and cutting, we're talking about gaining mass and losing mass. And the ideas that we have then coming from the bodybuilders have become more mainstream with the integration of the ideas and concepts of bodybuilding into the worlds of fitness, into the gymnasiums, into the fitness centers, and even into most of our social media feeds, which is where we get a lot of the ideas about how we should go about dieting, how we should go about exercising, what we should look like, even though it tends to give us a false impression as to what is healthy and what is optimal. And so if we look at that idea, we can integrate periodization into our diet without focusing on restriction of calories, restriction of carbohydrates, just like we do with exercise periodization, which is it's all going to start with what is the goal, how we develop that goal, and to fit into the timeline that we have for our overall wants and our overall needs. Where we can fall back onto the idea, okay, when should we see responses? When should we see peak plateaus? How can I modify my exercise? How can I modify my diet to get through those plateaus to continue peaking? Where we have to remember is that 4 weeks is basically when everybody will start to see all the changes that they want. 8 to 12 weeks is where we start to get that plateau. So it takes us 4 weeks to start to see results, and then another about 4 to 8 weeks after when we start seeing results, we're going to start seeing a tapering of the results. That doesn't mean that results won't continue to happen. It's just the rate at which they happen will be much slower. And when noticeable responses start to drop, it means that, okay, it's time to make some changes. And so this is where we can, once again, look back at what the bodybuilders have to offer. And one of the things I'm going to recommend here in terms of how we can go about periodizing it is not to say, okay, I'm simply going to follow one dietary dogma and stick with that one dietary dogma, but be flexible in the dogmatic practices that we have so that, let's say I want to follow the fasting style diet because I want to support my partner who's doing fasting. But I know that it's not going to be beneficial to me metabolically or physiologically. So I can, instead of doing a 5-2 program where 5 days of normal eating followed by 2 days of fasting, I'm going to do something like the alternate day, or I'm going to do something like time restricted eating. But I'm going to do it in such a way where I'm going to cut back on some of my nutrient intake. I'm going to change where my nutrients come from in terms of the macros, making sure that I still get my micros in the dosages that I need. But I'm going to do this in short bursts. So I'll do like a 1 to 2 week cutting pattern before I return to my normal dietary fashion, where I'm going to do time restricted feeding, where I'm going to do intermittent fasting, where I'm going to do alternate day fasting. That I know is going to have benefit to me metabolically as well as aesthetically. It's going to help me change my fat mass. I can do something where I can integrate a ketogenic diet for a very short period of time, where I doing my 5-2 program or my quasi intermittent fasting, where I'm still going to be eating, but for the days where I'm going to be quote unquote fasting, I'm going to be fasting following, say, like the induction phase or the introduction phase of a ketogenic diet, where I'm going to be consuming excessively low carbohydrates for 3 or 4 days in a row, followed by slowly reintroducing carbohydrates up until I get to what my minimum carbohydrate load needs to be for the day, which is somewhere around 120 to 140 grams of carbohydrates in a day. And what's important to remember is that during these changes, the exercise program that you're going to follow has to change so that you maximize the metabolic responses that we're hoping to get, which means that I'm going to make sure that I'm going to match my changes in exercise to my changes in diet. And what this does is this is going to help me get through the mental block of, I have to follow this excessive restricted diet. I have to do this. I have to do that. Where I know, okay, I'm simply changing for a week or two what my exercise pattern is and what my diet pattern is. So that I know that during my transition phase, in between one period of exercise to another period of exercise, I may follow a lower carbohydrate diet, or I may do a time restricted feeding, or I may do an alternate day fasting, or I may do a fasting mimicking diet style, or a diet mimicking fasting style diet, so that I'm able to go about continuously making changes in my body, in my physiology, without becoming excessively restrictive or becoming excessively coercive in what I need to do. Because what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're not causing such a cognitive drive in wanting to eat that we negate any benefit that we might get from doing diet or doing exercise. This is where when we make these changes, we want to make sure we're making these changes in such a way that they're self-motivated, self-monitored, and self-selected. So they're not coercive, because the cognitive drive is going to be not. So when we look at this, what we don't want to have a coercive cognitive drive. We want to have a cognitive drive that does not focus on one specific thing as the determinant of value, where the cognitive drive does not focus on comparison of body image to somebody else, that does not focus on weight on the scale as being the determinant of how well my program is working, or where we attempt to equate the calories being consumed with the calories being expended. We want to make sure that what we're doing in our periodization, what we're doing in any of our dieting patterns, is we're making sure that we're not doing things that are so coercive or so focused on external rewards that we're going to cause cognitive drive issues for ourselves, where we're going to cause sensations of body dysmorphia to take hold, or instigate exercise bulimic responses. So body dysmorphic issues can come about, body image issues can come about, where I am constantly comparing how my diet and how my exercise is going relative to what I see on social media feeds, what I see in my friends, what I see in my colleagues. When we start comparing ourselves to other people, we can have a dysmorphic idea as to what normal looks like. And because we have this dysmorphic idea about what normal looks like, we're never happy with the outcome that we happen to see. And so we're constantly trying to eat less, exercise more. We're constantly trying to cut and cut and cut and cut and cut and become excessively restrictive and even more restrictive, in what we're consuming, so that we can reach that goal that we can never reach because it's not ideal. It's not something that is realistic for us. And one of the things that comes into play when we start looking at this idea about periodizing diet, or even when we're looking at doing the fasting style diets, we can't do it with the mindset of caloric balance. And the reason why we can't do it with the mindset of caloric balance is because very little of our total energy requirements for the day come about through the exercise that we do. We're looking at additive to our normal metabolism, but the additive to our normal metabolism is not as great as what we think it is. And that's where we cannot be excessively restricted in our diet or excessively active in our exercise as a means to offset the quote unquote imbalance in between calories. This is where we have to utilize our nutrient balance points as opposed to our caloric balance points when establishing our diets as we go through our dietary restrictions or as we go through our dietary modifications. When we start looking at this dietary modification, we have to remember that periodization works. Periodization works in our exercise regimen, and periodization should work in our dietary regimens. As long as we follow a planned strategy to modify both diet and exercise in parallel with each other, so that we do not get stagnation, so we do not get extended plateaus within our responses to diet and exercise, so that we do not reach a point of overtraining or exhaustion in our changes, so that we're able to have overreaching, which is good because it's going to propel us into the next stage of our betterment, but not reach the point of overtraining where we're actually causing harm to the body. And this is what happens with excessively restricted diet. This is what happens when we have overabundance of exercise without the appropriate level of recovery. This is where we have the idea of periodizing our overload as opposed to have continuous overload. While we do need overload in exercise in order to cause hypertrophy, in order to cause muscle growth, we don't necessarily have to have continuous overload in order to get that response to take place. If we want to have weight loss, we don't have to have continuous restriction in our diet in order to have weight loss. Having modifications of diet sporadically throughout will cause metabolic stresses to come into play that can and do lead to the metabolic changes that are necessary in order to increase flexibility within metabolite utilization, that are able to increase endurance of tissues that need to exhibit endurance, that are able to stimulate the increase of mitochondria, which is going to make us more aerobically fit, which is also going to increase the fat utilization within our metabolism. Which remember is that when we're looking at what type of metabolites we're using, changes in diet will impact the ability to utilize metabolites based off of a concept known as metabolite availability. And when we start making big changes in our metabolite availability, we will make big changes in our overall metabolic rates and our overall metabolism and metabolic health based off of hormonal responses, based off of metabolite responses, as well as changes in nutrient loading based off of regulation of eating behaviors. And so we know that we get benefit from following various types of dietary practices. We know that we get benefit from altering these dietary practices so that we have continuous improvement in weight loss, continuous improvement in metabolic health, continuous improvement in cardiovascular health, continuous improvement in musculoskeletal health. What we have to remember is that when we start applying these general principles, it's not universally beneficial across all people and across all styles, especially if we're looking at the reward of weight loss as being one of the goals. We know that there's noted differences in the responses that we see in the fasting style diets, where We get very similar responses in time-restricted eating, alternate day fasting, and dieting mimicking fasting style fasts when compared with the responses that we see with the intermittent fasting style fasts. The differences that we see based off of dietary restrictions appear to be based off of social gender identifications, male, female, women, men, of the person based off of hormonal influences and the individual characteristics that the person has based off of those hormonal influences to regulate metabolism and by extension, body weight, if we happen to look at body weight as being one of the goals. So what are the general recommendations that we can make as it relates to the fasting style diets and possible explanation for why some individuals may gain weight while some individuals may lose weight following the same style diet? This is where we can look at it based off of the social normed values of men and women. For men, using any of the fasting style diets has benefit for both metabolic health as well as physiological responses. The end of that is going to be weight loss. For women, avoiding intermittent fasting should be accepted. Using time-restricted feeding, which some people refer to as intermittent fasting, is probably beneficial. Using alternate day fasting is probably beneficial. But true intermittent fasting, where you're going to take 2 days of abstinence or 2 days of excessively restricted food intake, followed by normal food intake for the remainder of the week, is not recommended for women as it is for men. And that's because of the hormonal responses that we see stemming from those dietary changes. But including some style of that fasting diet into your periodization of diets relative to your exercise may be of benefit for all individuals. Well, thanks for listening. Hopefully get a little bit out of the discussion here as it relates to fasting style diets and how we can maybe incorporate a little bit of periodization ideas into how we go about dieting. If you have questions about your diet or if you have questions in general, please feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to discuss stuff with you. Make sure you're giving us that big 5-star rating. Make sure you give us that big thumbs up. Sharing out what we're putting out there with all your friends and family. We appreciate that very much. Stay tuned for further discussions on diet, on exercise, and on some of the misconceptions that we have about how the human body works.